For the first year in Oakhaven, my life was measured in pounds of ground chuck and the number of chicken breasts I could fit in my freezer. It was a quiet, unassuming existence I had chosen for myself, a self-imposed exile from a life that had grown too loud, too crowded with ghosts. My cottage was small, my work was remote, and my human interaction was limited to the cashier at the grocery store and the man who ran the post office. And Marcus was the town butcher. He was not a relic. The shop, Callahan's Meats, was clean and modern, all gleaming steel and white tile. But Marcus himself felt like something from a bygone era. He was a man of quiet economy, in both his movements and his words. He moved behind the counter with a grace that belied his size, his broad shoulders and thick arms handling cleavers and knives with a surgeon's precision. My weekly trip to Callahan's became the fixed point in my drifting calendar. It was an anchor. I'd stand on the other side of the glass, watching him work, the scent of sawdust and cold, clean meat filling my lungs. He rarely smiled, but his eyes, a deep and steady brown, held a warmth that his mouth did not. He'd look up when the bell over the door chimed, give a short, sharp nod, and wait. "The usual, Leo?" he'd ask. His voice was a low rumble, like stones shifting deep underground. The first time he used my name, I almost dropped my wallet. I'd paid with a card, of course, but I never expected him to remember. It felt like an intimacy I hadn't earned. After that, the usual became our ritual. 2 bone-in pork chops, a pound of ground sirloin, and a half-dozen of his house-made sausages. He'd wrap each item in thick, waxy brown paper, his large hands folding the corners with an origami-like neatness. I started finding excuses to go more often. A sudden craving for steak. A dinner party for one that required a small roast. I needed to see him, to stand in the quiet hum of his refrigerated displays, and just watch. I studied the way the muscles in his forearms tensed when he sharpened a knife, the sprinkle of dark hair that disappeared under the sleeve of his white shirt. I memorized the small scar that cut through his left eyebrow, a tiny imperfection on a face of rugged symmetry. He never made small talk, and for that, I was grateful. Our exchanges were brief, transactional, yet they felt more significant than any conversation I'd had in years. The weight of the wrapped meat in my hands felt like a secret past between us. I would leave his shop feeling strangely full, the silence of my cottage less oppressive than before. My loneliness was still there, a constant companion, but it had a new flavor now. It was laced with a yearning so sharp and specific it was almost a comfort. The touches began subtly. So subtly, in fact, that for weeks I convinced myself I was imagining them. When he'd pass the parcel over the counter, his fingers would brush against mine. It was nothing, a simple consequence of a handoff in a small space. But his skin was always warm, a stark contrast to the cold of the wrapped meat, and the contact, however brief, sent a spark straight up my arm. I'd feel it long after I'd left the shop, a phantom warmth on my own chilled skin. I started replaying the moments in my head, dissecting them with the obsessive focus of a detective. His gaze. Did it linger a second longer than necessary when I met his eyes? The corner of his mouth. Did it twitch, just slightly, as if fighting a smile when I fumbled with my change? I was a man starving, and Marcus was offering me crumbs, and I devoured every single one, convincing myself it was a feast. One Tuesday, I went in for chicken thighs. It was raining, a miserable, gray drizzle that had been going on for days. The shop was empty, the only sound the buzz of the coolers and the rhythmic thud of Marcus's cleaver. He was breaking down a side of beef, his focus absolute. I stood there for a full minute, just watching. He was all controlled strength, a study in masculine competence that made my own life of words and screens feel flimsy and insubstantial. He finally looked up, his eyes finding mine in the reflection of the glass case. He didn't seem surprised to see me standing there, silent. He simply wiped his hands on his apron, leaving a faint crimson smear on the white canvas, and came to the counter. "Not a day for grilling," he said. His voice filled the quiet space. "No." I managed my own voice sounding thin. "Soup, I think. A chicken soup kind of day." He nodded, his expression unreadable. "Best thing for a day like this." He retrieved the thighs and began to wrap them. As he handed the package to me, his hand covered mine completely for a moment, pressing the cold parcel into my palm. His thumb stroked the back of my hand once, a deliberate, gliding motion. It was unmistakable. It wasn't an accident. It was a clear, calculated touch that sent a shockwave through my entire system. My breath hitched. I looked up at him, my eyes wide with a question I was too terrified to ask. His gaze was steady, intense. He didn't look away. He didn't smile. He just held my eyes, his hand still covering mine. The world narrowed to the space between us, the cold counter, the smell of rain and iron. Then he pulled his hand back, turned, and went back to his work. The transaction was over. I stumbled out of the shop, the bell mocking my hasty retreat. I didn't remember walking home. I stood in my kitchen, the rain beating against the window panes, and stared at my hand. I could still feel the phantom pressure of his thumb, a brand I could feel but not see. My mind was a chaotic storm of hope and fear. Hope that it meant what I thought it meant. Fear that I was a lonely man projecting his desires onto the quiet butcher, building a fantasy from a foundation of nothing. That single touch shifted everything. The dynamic between us was now charged with an unspoken current. My visits to the shop became exercises in exquisite tension. The air vibrated with what we weren't saying. The silences were no longer comfortable. They were loaded, heavy with questions. I'd ask for a cut of meat, and it would feel like I was asking for something else entirely. He would wrap it, and it would feel like a response. I found myself analyzing his aprons. Some days they were pristine white. Other days they bore the marks of his trade. I wondered who did his laundry. Did he live alone? The question echoed the cavernous nature of my own life. I built a whole biography for him in my head, a tapestry woven from silence and speculation. He had a dog, a big, quiet one like him. He lived in a small house just outside of town, with a woodpile and a porch swing. He read history books and listened to old vinyl records. He was a man of substance, of quiet passions. He was everything I wasn't. The town's annual Founders' Day festival arrived in late September, a burst of forced cheer before the long, gray winter. I had no intention of going. Crowds made me anxious, and the manufactured joy of such events always highlighted my own isolation. But a flyer appeared on my door, and I saw that Callahan's Meats was sponsoring the barbecue competition. Marcus would be there. The thought of seeing him outside the context of his shop, away from the barrier of the counter, was both thrilling and terrifying. It felt like a test. So I went. The park was a cacophony of shouting children, bad country music, and the sizzle of a dozen grills. I felt immediately out of place, a ghost at a feast. I scanned the crowd, my heart pounding a nervous rhythm against my ribs, and then I saw him. He was standing behind a massive smoker, wearing a simple black t-shirt and jeans. His apron was gone. Without the white uniform, he looked different, younger, less like an institution and more like a man. He was laughing, actually laughing at something one of the other contestants said. The sound was deep and genuine, and it reached across the park and hit me like a physical blow. I had never heard him laugh. I had never seen the crinkles that formed at the corners of his eyes when he truly smiled. It was like seeing the sun for the first time. I wanted to bottle that sound. I wanted to be the one who caused it. I hovered at the edge of the crowd, unsure of what to do. Approaching him felt like crossing a sacred boundary. Here, he was not my butcher. Here, I was not his customer. We were just two men in a park. The thought was paralyzing. As if he could feel my gaze, he turned his head and his eyes locked directly onto mine. The smile faded from his face, replaced by that familiar, unreadable intensity. He gave a slight nod, an acknowledgement that I was there. It wasn't an invitation, but it wasn't a dismissal either. It was just a fact. You are here. I see you. My courage, what little I had, failed me. I gave a weak, pathetic wave and retreated, melting back into the crowd. I spent another hour wandering aimlessly, eating a dry hot dog and pretending to be interested in a display of homemade quilts. All the while, I was acutely aware of him, a magnetic north I couldn't ignore. I could feel his presence even when my back was turned. Just as I was about to give up and go home, a sudden, torrential downpour sent everyone scattering for cover. The sky opened up, and within seconds, the cheerful festival dissolved into chaos. I found myself huddled under the small awning of the information booth, shivering as the cold rain soaked through my jacket. A figure appeared beside me, dripping and silent. It was Marcus. "Forgot your umbrella?" he asked, his voice low and close to my ear to be heard over the drumming rain. I jumped, startled. Ah, yes. I wasn't expecting this. Never do, he said, staring out at the deluge. Water dripped from his dark hair, tracing a path down his temple. I watched, mesmerized, as a single drop clung to the sharp line of his jaw. My hand twitched with the insane urge to reach out and wipe it away. We stood in silence for a long time, a comfortable quiet that felt different from the loaded silences in the shop. Here, huddled together against the storm, we were just two people seeking shelter. The pretense fell away. Your ribs looked good, I said, just to say something. He shrugged, a small, self-deprecating movement. They're okay. My grandfather's recipe. He always said the secret wasn't the sauce, it was the patience. It was the most he'd ever said to me at one time. A piece of his history, a glimpse behind the curtain. He taught you the trade. He did, Marcus said, a nostalgic softness in his voice. Taught me everything. How to hold a knife, how to respect the animal, how to treat a customer right. He paused, then looked at me. Said you can tell a lot about a man by the cut of meat he orders. My heart seized. Oh, and what do my pork chops say about me? I tried to make it a joke, but my voice trembled. He didn't laugh. He just watched my face, his expression serious. They say you appreciate something simple and honest. Something reliable. The rain began to slow, the drumming easing to a steady patter. The world felt quiet, washed clean. The intensity of his gaze was a physical weight, and I had to look away, my face burning. Reliable. Honest. Was that how he saw me? Or was he talking about himself? I should go, I mumbled, stepping out from under the awning into the light drizzle. My cottage, the windows might be open. It was a clumsy, obvious lie. Leo, I stopped my back to him. Your truck won't make it up your road in this mud, he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. My cottage was at the end of a long, unpaved track that turned to soup in the rain. I'll give you a lift. My Jeep can handle it. I turned back to him, my mind racing. Getting into his car felt like an irrevocable step, a crossing of a threshold. But the alternative, trudging a mile through the mud, was unthinkable. And a deeper, more reckless part of me wanted this. It wanted the proximity, the shared space, the continuation of this strange, fragile connection. Okay, I said, the word barely a whisper. Thank you. The inside of his Jeep smelled of leather, rain, and something else that was uniquely him, a faint, clean scent of sawdust and spice. It was masculine and comforting. The drive was mostly silent, the only sound the rhythmic slap of the windshield wipers and the squelch of the tires in the mud. He navigated the treacherous road with an easy, confident control that I found myself envying. When we pulled up to my cottage, he killed the engine. The silence that descended was absolute. I didn't move. I couldn't. I sat there, staring at my own front door, acutely aware of his presence beside me. The warmth of his body seemed to radiate across the small space of the cab. I could hear him breathing, a slow, steady rhythm. Thanks again, I said finally, my hand on the door handle. I really appreciate it. It's no trouble. Still, I didn't move. My hand was frozen on the handle. This is it, I thought. The moment ends here. He'll drive away, and tomorrow I'll go to the shop and we'll pretend this never happened. The thought was unbearable. I am not a brave man. My life is a testament to my own cowardice, a long series of retreats and avoidances. But in that moment, something inside me broke. Maybe it was the rain, or the unexpected kindness, or the way he'd looked at me when he talked about his grandfather. Do you want to come in for a coffee or something? The words tumbled out, clumsy and desperate. To warm up. He turned his head and looked at me. His face was shadowed in the fading light, his expression impossible to read. The silence stretched, each second a tiny eternity. I was already backtracking in my head, preparing my apology, my dismissal of the offer. Just a silly idea. Of course you have to go. Forget I said anything. Okay, he said, his voice quiet. Coffee sounds good. Relief washed over me so intensely my legs felt weak. He followed me inside, his large frame seeming to fill my small entryway. He stood awkwardly for a moment, dripping onto the welcome mat, looking around my living room. It was filled with books and art, a reflection of my cluttered interior world. I suddenly felt exposed, as if he could read my entire history in the spines of the books on my shelves. I'll just put the kettle on, I said, escaping to the kitchen. My hands were shaking as I filled the kettle. I could feel his presence in the other room, a solid, grounding weight. This is happening. He is in my house. The thought repeated itself, a frantic mantra. I heard his footsteps, and he appeared in the kitchen doorway, leaning against the frame. He had taken off his wet jacket. The black t-shirt clung to his chest and shoulders, and I quickly looked away, focusing on spooning coffee grounds into the French press. You have a lot of books, he observed. It's a problem, I said, trying for a light tone. Doesn't look like a problem. He was quiet for a moment. Looks like a life. His word struck me. A life. I had always thought of it as a hiding place. He saw it differently. He walked further into the kitchen, his curiosity seeming to outweigh his initial awkwardness. He stopped in front of a small, abstract painting I had done, a swirl of blues and grays that hung on the wall. It was a visual representation of my first few months in Oakhaven, melancholy and confused. You paint, he asked. Sometimes. Just for myself. He reached out, his fingers hovering just over the canvas, not quite touching it. It's sad, he said, his voice soft. But it feels honest. He turned from the painting to look at me, and his eyes held a new understanding. It was a look that went beyond butcher and customer. He was seeing me, Leo, the man who lived with books and painted his sadness. And I felt a terrifying, exhilarating wave of vulnerability. I wanted to cover the painting, to cover myself. I also wanted him to never stop looking. The kettle whistled, a shrill scream that broke the tension. I busied myself with the coffee, pouring the hot water, stirring, pressing the plunger. The simple domestic ritual was a lifeline. I handed him a mug, and our fingers brushed. This time, the touch was different. It wasn't the fleeting, electric shock of the shop. It was warmer, more lingering. A question and an answer all at once. We drank our coffee in the living room, sitting on opposite ends of my small sofa. The space between us felt both vast and non-existent. He asked me about my work, and I told him I was a freelance editor, working on academic texts. It sounded dull when I said it out loud, but he listened with a quiet focus, nodding as if it were the most interesting job in the world. Must be quiet work, he said. It is. Do you like the quiet? The question was simple, but it felt deeply personal. Do you like this life you've made for yourself? Do you like the loneliness? Sometimes, I answered honestly. Sometimes it's too quiet. He just nodded, taking a slow sip of his coffee. His gaze drifted around the room again, and I saw my life through his eyes. The worn armchair, the stack of records by the stereo, the half-finished manuscript on my desk. It was a solitary existence. When he finished his coffee, he placed the mug carefully on the coaster I'd provided. The finality of the sound echoed in the quiet room. This was it. He would thank me and leave. Well, I began, my voice tight. Thanks for the ride. I trailed off, not sure what I was thanking him for. For seeing me? For not running away. He didn't stand up. He just sat there, looking at me, his brown eyes searching my face. Leo, he said, and my name on his lips was a physical touch. Why did you move here? No one had ever asked me that directly. The townspeople had their theories, I was sure. A bad breakup, a family tragedy, some scandal in the city. I had offered vague, evasive answers to anyone who pried. But Marcus asked it with such simple, genuine curiosity that a lie felt impossible. I needed a change, I said, the understatement of the century. The city was a lot. He seemed to accept that, sensing it was as much as I was willing to give. He finally stood, and my heart sank. He walked not to the door, but to the window, looking out at the darkening, rain-soaked landscape. It's quiet here, he said, more to himself than to me. But it's a good quiet. A clean quiet. He turned back to face me. He was just a few feet away now. My little cottage suddenly felt very, very small. I could smell the rain on his clothes, the coffee on his breath. My own breathing became shallow. This is not happening. This is not real. He took a step closer. And another. He stopped directly in front of me, so close I had to tilt my head back to look up at him. I could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. I could see the faint stubble on his jaw. My entire world had contracted to the space he occupied. Your usual, he said, his voice a low whisper. Pork chops, sirloin, sausage, he listed them like a prayer. You cook for yourself every night. I could only nod, my throat too tight for words. Must get lonely, he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of empathy. He understood. And then he reached out, not with the quick, furtive touch of the shop, but with a slow, deliberate movement. His hand came up and cupped my jaw, his thumb stroking the line of my cheekbone. His skin was calloused, but incredibly gentle. My eyes fluttered shut. This is real. He is here. He is touching me. The thought is a blinding flash of light in the long darkness of my solitude. My own hands rise, seemingly of their own accord, and rest on his chest. I can feel the steady, solid beat of his heart beneath my palm. It is the most grounding sensation I have ever felt. The next week was a blur of nervous energy and quiet anticipation. Nothing had happened after that moment in my living room. He had held my face for a long, silent beat, his thumb stroking my skin, and then he had simply dropped his hand, said, "Good night, Leo," and left. He'd left me standing in the middle of my living room, trembling, my skin tingling where he'd touched me, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. I didn't know what it meant. Was it a gesture of comfort? An aborted attempt at something more? I replayed the moment 1,000 times, analyzing every flicker in his eyes, every slight shift in his breath. I was driving myself insane. I avoided the butcher shop for 4 days. I ate canned soup and stale crackers, punishing myself with a bland diet as if in penance for my own wild hopes. But by Friday, I couldn't stand it anymore. The not knowing was worse than any potential rejection. I needed my anchor. I needed to see him. I walked into the shop, the bell chiming my arrival like a death knell. He was there, wiping down the counter. He looked up, and for a split second, I saw something in his eyes. Relief? Surprise? It was gone before I could be sure, replaced by his usual stoic calm. "Leo," he said. His voice was even. Normal. "Marcus," I replied, my own voice betraying a slight tremor. I walked to the counter, my legs feeling like lead. "I need some steaks." For grilling. The lie was absurd. The ground was still saturated from the storm, but it was all I could think of. He didn't call me on it. He simply turned to the display case. "Ribeyes okay?" "Perfect." He selected 2 thick, beautifully marbled steaks and placed them on the paper. The silence in the shop was deafening. I could hear the buzz of the fluorescent lights, the frantic beat of my own pulse. "Please," I thought. "Say something. Do something. Give me a sign." He worked slowly, his movements precise and deliberate as always. He folded the waxy paper, creasing the edges with his thumbnail. He pulled a length of red and white string from the dispenser. He wrapped it around the parcel once, then twice. My heart hammered. This was it. The moment of truth. The transaction would end, and I would know. If he just handed it to me, then I had imagined everything. The touch on my hand, the look in the rain, the hand on my face. It was all a fantasy spun from loneliness. He finished the knot. He held the package for a moment, his knuckles white. He looked at me, his eyes dark and serious. Then, instead of pushing the parcel across the counter, he kept hold of the string. With a slow, deliberate motion, he reached across the space between us. He looped the loose end of the string around my wrist. My breath caught in my throat. I stared down at the thin, striped cord encircling my pulse point. It wasn't tight, but it felt like a manacle, a connection, a claim. He tied a small, neat bow. Then he looked up, his eyes locking with mine. He gave the string a gentle but firm tug. I stumbled forward, my hands landing on the cold steel of the counter to steady myself. He pulled again, and I was leaning over the counter, the glass of the display case pressing into my stomach. He didn't let go. He held me there, tethered to him by a fragile piece of butcher's twine. The world outside the shop faded away. There was only his face, inches from mine. His eyes, dark and bottomless. The scent of him, clean and masculine. "Marcus," I breathed, the name a question, a plea. He didn't answer with words. He closed the small distance between us and pressed his mouth to mine. It wasn't a soft kiss. It was firm, demanding, a kiss of profound and long-suppressed hunger. It was the kiss of a patient man who had finally run out of patience. His lips were chapped but warm, and he tasted faintly of coffee and certainty. It was a kiss that said, "Finally." It said, "I see you." It said, "You are not alone." My eyes slid shut. I leaned into him, my body pliant, all the tension and fear and desperate yearning of the past year melting away in the heat of his mouth. My hands left the cold counter and found his shoulders, gripping the starched fabric of his shirt. He was so solid, so real. This was not a fantasy. This was happening. He pulled back, but only an inch. Our foreheads rested against each other. His breath was warm on my face. He was breathing heavily, as if he'd been running. I opened my eyes. He was looking at me with an expression of such raw vulnerability it stole the air from my lungs. The stoic mask was gone. In its place was the man who had laughed in the park, the man who had looked at my sad painting and seen honesty. Been wanting to do that for a long time, he rasped, his voice thick. Me too, I whispered, the confession feeling like the bravest thing I had ever said. He let go of the string. My wrist felt strangely light, strangely empty. He reached over and untied the bow, his fingers gentle. He coiled the string and tucked it into his apron pocket, as if saving a memento. Then his hand found mine, his fingers lacing through mine across the counter. His grip was strong, sure. The bell over the door chimed. We sprang apart like startled teenagers. Mrs. Gable, the town's chief gossip and my next-door neighbor, bustled in, shaking her umbrella. "Terrible weather we're having," she announced to the room at large, before her sharp eyes landed on me. "Oh, Leo, fancy seeing you here. Getting something for your supper?" My face was on fire. I was sure she could see the kiss still imprinted on my lips. I stammered something incoherent, grabbing my package of steaks. Marcus, however, was a picture of calm. "Just helping Leo out," he said, his voice perfectly even. "Have a good night, Leo." The emphasis he put on my name was subtle, but I heard it. It was a promise. I fled the shop, my heart pounding a wild, joyous, terrified rhythm. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by my window, watching the rain and replaying the kiss, the feel of the string on my wrist, the warmth of his hand in mine. It felt like a dream. I was terrified I would wake up. The next morning, there was a knock on my door. It was early, the sun barely up. My heart leaped into my throat. I pulled the door open, and he was there. Marcus. He was holding a small paper bag. He wasn't in his work clothes, just jeans and a gray Henley that stretched across his chest. "I, brought you breakfast," he said, looking slightly awkward, out of his element. He held up the bag. "Sausage biscuits. From the diner." I stepped aside and let him in. He walked into my kitchen as if he belonged there, placing the bag on the counter. The silence returned, but this time it was different. It wasn't the loaded tension of the shop or the nervous quiet of our first coffee. It was a hesitant, hopeful silence. "You shouldn't have done that," I said softly. "Yesterday. In the shop. With Mrs. Gable right there." "Probably not," he admitted, not looking at me. He busied himself taking the biscuits out of the bag. "But I told you." I ran out of patience. He finally turned to face me. "Was it okay?" "Okay." I let out a breathy, incredulous laugh. "Marcus, it was—" I searched for the word. There wasn't one big enough. It was everything. A slow smile spread across his face. A real smile, the one that made the corners of his eyes crinkle. It lit up his entire face, and I felt my own lips mirroring the expression. "Good," he said simply. We ate the biscuits standing in the kitchen, the early morning light streaming through the window. It was the best breakfast I had ever had. After we finished, he took my empty wrapper and his own and threw them in the trash. He rinsed his hands at the sink, then turned to me, drying them on his jeans. "So," he said, his smile fading into something more serious. "What happens now?" It was the question that had been haunting me all night. What did this mean? Was it a momentary lapse? A single, perfect moment to be treasured like the string he'd pocketed? I took a breath. For the first time in a long time, I didn't want to retreat. I didn't want to hide. I wanted to be brave. "I was thinking," I said, my voice steadier than I expected, "that I have these two beautiful ribeye steaks, and I don't want to eat them alone." His eyes softened. Yeah, I confirmed. "So, I was hoping you might come over for dinner tonight. We could figure it out. Together." He closed the space between us and took my hand, lacing his fingers through mine. His palm was warm and solid against my own. It felt like coming home. "I'd like that, Leo," he said, his voice a low, comforting rumble. "I'd like that very much." That evening, he came over. He brought a bottle of red wine and a small bunch of wildflowers that he'd clearly picked from the side of the road. They were clumsy and beautiful, and I put them in a glass jar on the center of the table. We cooked together. We moved around my small kitchen in an easy, comfortable dance. His large, capable hands, the ones I'd only ever seen wield a cleaver, were surprisingly deft as he chopped onions. I watched him, a quiet joy blooming in my chest. This man, this quiet, steady man, was in my home, in my life. We ate, and we talked. We talked for hours. He told me about his grandfather, about the pressure he felt to keep the family business alive. I told him about the city, about the noise and the loneliness that had driven me here. We shared the quiet, wounded parts of ourselves, offering them up like gifts. After dinner, we sat on the sofa, the same sofa where he had first touched my face. This time, there was no space between us. I was leaned against his side, his arm wrapped securely around my shoulders. His presence was a solid, comforting weight. It was the anchor I had been searching for. I thought about my life before, measured in pounds of meat and solitary nights. It had been a quiet life, yes, but it was the sterile quiet of an empty room. This new quiet, the one settling around us now, was different. It was a shared quiet, rich and full of unspoken understanding. It was the clean quiet he had talked about. He tilted my chin up, and his kiss this time was slow and gentle, a question and a promise. It held all the patience he had talked about, a deep, steady assurance that we had time. There was no need to rush. Lying in his arms, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing, I looked around my little cottage. The books, the paintings, the worn armchair. It no longer looked like a hiding place. It looked like a life. And for the first time, it felt like one I was finally ready to live.